Hey everyone, Corbin here, and the next part of my kitchen cabinets project is making dovetail drawers. I start off by firing up SketchUp and printing out the dimensions of the drawers I want to make. Alright, I'm going to use hard maple for my drawers at 5/8 of an inch thick as shown in my model, and I'm going to just go ahead and plane down my 1/1 stock down to 5/8 of an inch as usual. My drawer sizes are going to be based on the Blum hardware that I'm going to be using. And you can also do 3/4 of an inch drawers, but I find 5/8 of an inch looks a little bit better. 3/4 of an inch is just a little bit too thick. So my general process is to rough cut to length the boards that I need, and then I rip them. And it's easier to rip boards when they're in smaller lengths. You can more easily manage them and they don't warp as much. After I rip them, I go ahead and cross-cut them to final length, and I have all the boards that I'll need to actually start creating my drawers. Some of my drawers are really tall, and I just biscuit joint the two pieces together, and that way I'll have a taller piece. I use a Leigh D4R jig to cut my dovetails. I do half-blind dovetails, and that way I don't actually have to change the bits out or change any of the heights when I do one cut to another. I don't want to teach you how to use the jig as the directions are pretty clear, but I want to show some of the things that I've learned while using the jig and things that I've figured out to make it easier. One of the first things I realized, it's actually easier to use a plunge router base as opposed to the regular router base. And a regular router base, you can kind of like screw down the router adjustment, but I found that that would actually not be that accurate to move it down or up due to play. The plunge router, I can just do minute increments by doing, say, a shim of a piece of paper between the stop and whatnot, and just shoving it down against that and do a tiny bit of further deepness into the cut or upwards or whatever you need to do. And so the plunge router works a lot better for me. When I place a board in, I'd have to make sure there are no gaps anywhere so that the top pieces, the metal aluminum, was actually sitting on the board and had no gaps. If it had a gap, it would create an inconsistency. And you want to make sure that the board is slammed against the left and slammed against the back. If it's not, you'll have a problem. The jig itself creates nice dovetails, and it is pretty quick to do it. After I cut all the dovetails in the 4 side pieces, I go ahead and rip some plywood to size. I make it a 1/4 inch larger on each side to fit into a 1/4 inch groove in the side pieces. So that's a 1/2 inch larger for each. Cutting the grooves for the drawer bottoms is pretty easy. I just set a dado stack up to be the exact width that I need to have it be, and go ahead and run all the pieces through. The dovetail thickness is rather important for you to not cut a groove that actually cuts the pin away. And so just be aware that you probably want it to be above that groove location to hide it completely. After I have everything cut, I go ahead and do some test fitting and rectify any errors. I will frequently sand the bottom down if it doesn't fit in the groove quite smoothly enough, because you need to kind of more easily slide the bottom piece into the groove. If it doesn't slide pretty easily, then I'll go ahead and sand it down a bit. Once I am pretty happy with the fit, I'll go ahead and sand the interior pieces and the plywood bottom. I start with 150 usually, and then go to 220. Sometimes I'll use 100 if it's really rough, but usually just 150 and 220 is fine for what I want to do. After I sanded, I am ready for glue up. And I've discovered a technique that works pretty well for me, and so I'm going to demonstrate what I do here. First of all, I glue the plywood bottom in. So I go ahead and just run a quick strip of glue down in my grooves. I don't spray it out because it doesn't really need to be glued in, and this is just a little bit of extra to make the drawer really solid. And plywood is dimensionally stable, so I never worry about gluing plywood into drawers and face fronts and whatnot. After I do that, I go ahead and just start dabbing some glue into the sockets. I coat any area that will touch with some other wood into the sockets or the pin side of the half blind. after I do that, I can do the actual dovetail side. So I'm going to pull out the dovetail side, or maybe I'll do the other half blind side. We'll see. I guess I decided to go ahead and put in the bottom piece. So what I do is I space the bottom piece in the half blind side so that it has equal portions showing on each side. So I'm tapping it to get a little bit centered a little bit more. And once I have it dead center, I go ahead and pound it down all the way. I want to pound it down so that it is flush against that edge, because my plywood is very square and I can use the plywood to actually square up the drawer by pounding it against it. So what I'm doing is I'm just kind of looking down and looking for any gaps that I see. If I see a gap, I'll pound it a little bit more. So I grab the other side and fill in its sockets with glue, just like I did the opposite side. And I just put a light coating of glue. I don't want to put too much, and I don't really get it on the inside, because if you get glue out on the inside, it's kind of a pain to remove. Glue out on the outside is easy to remove, and you're going to probably sand the dovetails anyways on the outside. So what I do is I just feed it into the bottom of the drawer, and again I try and center it so that it's equal on each sides, and I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'll sometimes toss the piece so that it's on end to add the other side in, and this way I can help ensure that it is actually equally compressed into each side. So now I'm just going to do the same thing I did before. Go ahead and cover the dovetails with a light coating of glue. And I would always forget to actually put the open end grain portion with a little bit of glue, and I'm not forgetting right now, but it's always important to do that. I don't spread out the glue that's actually in the groove because I'm not too worried about the groove. Glue in the groove is kind of just like bonus holding. You don't really need it because the main thing that's going to hold the drawer together are the dovetails and not the plywood being glued in. So at this point I can start to gently push the dovetails in, and usually one side, if I made the drawer bottom to be slightly smaller so it kind of has some play, one side will have to kind of come out a little bit. And what I want to do is have that same side come out on each one that I glue up. Otherwise you will get a drawer that's not quite square. I use a mallet, a rubber mallet, to go ahead and pound everything down. Once I have 3 pieces in, I start checking for squareness. And if it's not square, and here I can kind of tell it doesn't even look square. And so what I'll do is I'll pop it out and kind of just push it on the side that needs to be down a little bit more and fix some of the squareness before I put in the last piece. So here I'm just pounding a side down that wasn't quite equal to the other side, and that's going to help a lot with squareness. At this point, I do the same thing for the last piece. I'll go ahead and add some glue to it and just paint it as before, and then I will flip it on end and just pound the piece on end really easily. Once I have pretty good squareness, I add the clamps, and what I'll do is I'll use the clamps to squish those sides into the dovetails. So those 2 clamps are probably adequate enough to actually clamp it together and let it dry. But sometimes I'll see little gaps on the half-blind dovetails that I want to not have there. And so I'll toss on a couple extra clamps on the opposite side to squish out those gaps. The last thing I do before sanding the drawers is to cut out a gap behind the back side of the drawer that is specific for the Blum hardware. So that's it. My drawers are ready for sanding and finishing.